not just about consumption, it's the value that's generated by that token. And I can tell you right now, based on the conversations I'm having with CIOs, 90+% of token consumption goes nowhere, right? You go into a chat interface, you make a request for information, you go back and forth, you consume a bunch of tokens, and then you abandon it.
Today, we're looking at one of the most important shifts in enterprise work happening right now, the rise of AI-powered document creation. Joining me today is Jean-Marc Chanoine, who's Chief Sales Officer at Templafy, a company that's been at the forefront of integrating AI and automation into the everyday tools knowledge workers use already, like Microsoft 365 and Copilot. Templafy helps organizations automate and standardize business document creation, helping large organizations produce compliant, on-brand documents quickly and at scale. So enjoy today's conversation. Hi, Jean-Marc. How are you today?
Doing great. How you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. So you've been leading companies through digital transformation really since your days at Accenture, so for quite a while now, and driving global sales at Templafy. But before we get technical, what feels most different about this moment that we're going through today with the AI, bringing AI into everyday document workflows, compared to previous big changes in technology that maybe we've seen in the past?
The biggest difference I see today is how deep that AI is going into individual employee workflows. I think when you look at organizations at the various compartments, right, whether it's sales, legal, delivery, product, whatever it is, I think the key difference was that solutions in the market were general. It was like, this solution does X. But the key differentiator between now and if you take it back to the SaaS revolution or even to the internet, or even going from essential centralized databases to essentially individuals having computers, I think there's a deep need to understand exactly what employees are doing. And really the biggest change is how quickly individuals have adopted this technology and how accessible that it's become for individuals. Now, that has presented all types of challenges that we haven't seen before, where we're going from X software or X new development does Y to a world where we're all trying to figure out exactly where the edges are between artificial intelligence and, in essence, what employees are doing. And so I think the speed now is tremendous. Every three months, things are completely different, right? If you go back last year, Copilot was in the lead. If you go to today, someone might say it's Claude. You'll hear that model performance has shifted. So I think the sheer amount of change that's occurring and the pace of change is just absolutely different. And so I think it's one of the key things that, especially at Templafy, it's what we're at is the cutting edge of how do employees work and how do you actually deliver value in this case.
Yeah, it's certainly hard to keep up with the change. Now, some people have said that, AI, what we've witnessed over the last couple of years, and certainly what's going to happen, in the near future, I'm sure, is bigger than the internet. Maybe that's an overstatement, maybe not, I don't know. But could you identify something that these changes that we've seen in AI over the last couple of years, what it kind of connects with historically in terms of the scale of the change? Is there a past tech that could help us make sense of what is happening right now?
I have two answers to that. One of them is very long ago, and one of them is more recent. I would say the printing press as the first answer. And it might sound like a crazy answer, but it was the first time in human history that knowledge essentially became available to the masses, right? But before the printing press, you'd have these large-scale libraries. If you're part of the upper bourne, you got access to this information. And so really when we think about AI, it's a revolution of knowledge. How do you get knowledge in the hands of people to create a broader understanding of the world? And if you essentially look at the historical trends, I think post creation of the printing press, that's when you had all of these new ideas in society of how to run it, the
Mm-hmm.
Renaissance, and everything occurring post the printing press, because knowledge went from being essentially an ivory tower thing to one where the average person could have access to it. But to bring it closer to technology, I think it really comes down to the internet. And the reason I choose the internet in this case and not cloud is that a lot of cloud was backend, right? It was changing how information was stored,
Mm-hmm.
how people got access to tools. But the realities are that something touching individual users to this level, it's that's the biggest change, right? And I think that
Mm-hmm.
the way to think about it is, if you take the average person, I'm a lawyer by training, right?
Right.
And let's say you take a brief written to the Supreme Court and you throw it at Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini and ask it, hey, make an assessment of the quality of the arguments. Even if someone knew absolutely nothing about the law, they would actually have a beautiful list of essentially the arguments, for and against the arguments being made in that brief. And the only reason I bring up this
Mm-hmm.
example is that you don't need to be an expert anymore in order to access that particular information. So when we think about the internet, it first it touched consumer, then you started seeing businesses quickly adopt in those scenarios. And so I think the biggest shift has been like, what do you do with this, right? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
internet compared to AI is truly a clean comparison, especially when you start thinking about how much of the internet is used to actually deliver productivity at an organization, right? Like how much of it is ESPN, right? How much of it is someone just browsing and sending messages, and how much of it
Mm-hmm.
is actually generating productivity? And so, one key question I always ask CIOs is, well, how many of your tokens actually resulted in some type of productivity gain? And no one right now can answer, because it's like more AI, essentially more consumption. And essentially, it's a case where when you think about a technological shift, it's in essence, it's people are consuming, and ultimately
Mm-hmm.
organizations want a result, and they don't know what component of that consumption is delivering that result. And it's also bringing information to people who otherwise wouldn't have that information, and
Mm-hmm.
lowering the reliance on, quote unquote experts.
Mm-hmm. I loved your example there of the printing press. As you said, all the knowledge was essentially kept in an ivory tower, and suddenly it became available, to the masses, if you like. And in some way, I kind of see AI, leveling the playing field. There are so many possibilities now that, if somebody wanted to start up a business, with limited resources or do things that only very large enterprises could do up until today, it's really going to allow, ordinary people to do things that have never really been possible to do before. Once they've got over the fear of AI, of course, there is going to be a lot of disruption and all the rest of it, I guess. But I think it's more exciting than it is scary. Now, we talked a bit about productivity there, and I know that a lot of boards are worried about the investment in AI not really showing a return on investment. So what does it take to really bring AI successfully into the heart of enterprise document workflows, so that it actually makes, a meaningful or measurable difference?
It's a fantastic question. And I could talk a bit about how Templafy approaches this.
Okay.
We're extremely good when the organization knows what it wants to accomplish, because there's some key components around control, right? Because
Okay.
what you
Yep.
don't want AI doing is making up numbers. You don't want it making up
Mm-hmm.
facts about the organization, and you want to be
Mm-hmm.
able to deploy it in a controlled fashion. And what
Yep.
we allow organizations to do is actually prompt the presentation for professionals in such a way that they can rely on the result. And I think one of the biggest problems right now to getting productivity in the document creation component of this AI explosion is trust, right? How do
Yep.
you trust the document or the content or the presentation or the proposal or the audit report that was generated? Because one of the observations we've had is when organizations are leveraging without the control AI to create content, it actually slows down the process because now they have to go back and review the entirety of the document that was created. They have to go
Mm-hmm.
back and cite the sources. They have to go back and make sure that
Mm-hmm.
ultimately the output is accurate. And so, when you're paying fees to a PwC, a Deloitte, a KPMG, an EY, a McKinsey, or whoever, your expectation on the output that you get from that organization when you're paying them is perfection.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't room
Mm-hmm.
for 95% correct,
Yeah.
93% correct. Their expectation is at these prices 100% correct. And when we work with organizations, we're focused to make sure that the things that need to be right are right when you leverage Templafy. And so one of the key reasons why it's been hard to get ROI is it comes down to the utility of a token consumed, right? So you've heard people get on podcasts and they're talking about, hey, an engineer, if there's a 500,000 engineer and, they're not spending 250,000 dollars on tokens, that again, there's an issue. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of that approach has been permeating in the enterprise space. And it's not just about consumption, it's the value that's generated by that token. And I can tell you
Mm-hmm.
right now, based on the conversations I'm having with CIOs, 90+% of token consumption goes nowhere, right? You go into a chat interface, you make a request for information, you go back and forth, you consume a bunch
Right.
of tokens, and then you abandon it.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
it's this weird space we're in now, which is great. Everyone has access to at least a basic AI tool at work now,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's in their free time or at work, but
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult to measure whether or not that consumption led to some value. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like marketing. Back when I was in business school over at Berkeley, they used to say that marketing works, but we don't know what 10% of the spend is actually effective. And I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
organizations are in the same bracket. It's like, yeah, it works, but we couldn't tell you, right, exactly what of that token
Mm-hmm.
consumption led to some type of improvement, which is why what you're seeing now is an explosion in token costs, while at the same time, actual productivity is relatively low. So that's why we're
Mm-hmm.
focused on great. When you leverage Templafy, we know that the output's going to be accurate, and it tends to be focused essentially on a deterministic output, right? You need a proposal, great. You need a contract,
Mm-hmm.
great. You need a pitch deck, fantastic. You're going to get an output that the organization has some control in making sure is correct at the onset.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess this question is really partly about, why is there a need for a product like Templafy, but where are teams getting stuck in practice when they're trying to integrate tools, like Copilot into their content processes? I guess I'm coming from the point of view, at least as a starting point, that maybe they're using it natively without something like Templafy. And then, where does Templafy fit into that?
I think it has to do with this is going to sound a little unusual. It has to do with the buyers, right? So who's in charge of buying AI generally? It's the CIO's office, right? Now, one of the key things we've observed in the enterprise market, there tends to be a disconnect between IT and the business. And what I mean by the
Mm-hmm.
disconnect, it has to do with what is the exact workflow, right? How is a particular document created? And if you think about how
Mm-hmm.
many of these models were trained, it's not like there were a million videos of someone building a proposal or a contract or whatever it is end to end. And so what's happening now is that there's a core focus in how is work actually getting done. It's the
Mm-hmm.
integrations into data sources. It's understanding how humans actually work together to create content. And so the way to think about it is that to create a presentation, right, I might go into a SharePoint, I might send a couple emails to my colleagues, I might jump into Salesforce, I might jump into Notion, and I might jump into Slack, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of that happens naturally. And remember, like most of our actual consumers are professionals, right? They're knowledge workers. They're people that went to
Mm-hmm.
great universities. They had 4 years of training. They had 5 years of apprenticeship when they were junior. And they have this essentially working knowledge of how to create it. So the biggest challenge I've seen up front is that you'll have a CIO's office say, great, here's your standard chat interface to interact with AI to essentially do research. But then at the onset of creation, you get, and I don't want to say AI slop, that's not a fair statement, but you get something that's uncontrolled. So the biggest
Hmm.
challenge is understanding how are employees actually going about creating that content. And what we do is basically come in order to allow organizations to rationalize that to get an output that's accurate. So really the big
Hmm.
challenge is deeply understanding how employees work, having the integrations into the data sources that are important, and then
Hmm.
assembling that in a controlled fashion so that way you can trust the output, right? Because you want AI to do its thing where it's supposed to be doing it, but you don't want it making up facts. You don't want it pulling from sources that don't make sense. And also, depending on the context window, you might get a single sentence answer when you really need 2 pages. And so
Right. Right.
it's really about that
Yep.
control piece that's currently, I would say, everyone's working on it, but we've mastered it.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned there, well, we've talked about trust quite a bit, and I think everybody's aware that that's an issue with using AI. At Microsoft's AI tour recently, Templafy demoed, how to create a pitch deck, and it was generated in minutes using Copilot and Templafy, the document agents, everything working together. So could you walk me through what that process and workflow actually looks like, because we're also talking about speed here, I think. Yeah, so let's say I have a deadline to create a pitch deck, an urgent proposal that needs to be put together within 1 hour. It needs to be polished, it needs to be brand perfect, all the information needs to be accurate. What would that actually look like when Templafy is in the mix?
And that's a fantastic question. So I'll take it before that moment, right? And what we want to think about is if it's a B2B company, right, and they're
Hmm.
doing proposals, and for most of their big deals, there's documents being created along the actual commercial journey. And so
Hmm.
oftentimes when we're working with organizations, we try to understand like how many of these are being created? Like how often are they being created? What is the
Hmm.
product suite? Like how does it integrate into Salesforce? Where is the information coming from? And we work with CIOs to actually deliver a custom solution that assures that when the proposal is actually created, it has all of the components. And all of this starts with what does good look like? Right. And I think what we do in a lot of those cases is we work with the organization to understand what are the mandatory components of a proposal, right? It's pricing,
Hmm.
it's the about us section, it's about how we compare to competitors. And we work with the organization to structure this. Now, by structuring this to make sure that these mandatory components show up, we end up in essence deploying this core, let's say scaffolding, right? The orchestration layer, right? And so based on that orchestration layer, what we're doing is we're delivering prompts, we're delivering a core template, and we're delivering the data exactly where it's supposed to be. So that way,
Hmm.
when a user goes into Copilot or they go into Claude or they go into ChatGPT, what we're able to do is take that orchestration layer and the scaffolding to assure that the instructions going
Right.
to the AI actually deliver an accurate output. And the way you want to think about it is that AI performs as well as the instructions and the context that it's given. And
Hmm.
really, what we hone in on is how do we deliver that particular infrastructure. Now, luckily for us, similar to NVIDIA, right? When NVIDIA was essentially selling chips, let's go back, 10 years, the focus was on video games. It was on video processing. What we were working on was automation, was how do you compile content within the M365 suite? So
Hmm.
by incident, we end up building, right, even before the big AI craze, the orchestration of how do you assign mandatory components to the right part of a document. And so what we can actually do in those cases is to assure that it's repeatable. So if John decides to create a proposal and Susie creates a proposal, what we can actually assure is that they're going to look extremely similar because there's a right answer in that
Hmm.
case, right? We know
Hmm.
where to
Hmm.
integrate. And so, you saw a bit of that demo, right? They go in and answer a few questions, and we're able to put out something that is quite consistent, I would say, as compared to just going into a core model and providing basic instructions and creating that output. And so
Mm-hmm.
the reason at the beginning of my long spiel here that I talked about this happens before you need to create a proposal is that we work with businesses, with the
Mm-hmm.
go-to-market teams, with marketing to say, what does good look like? And what we assure
Mm-hmm.
is that what good looks like is what actually occurs when a person's leveraging AI,
Mm-hmm.
down to the extent where we can even call out what parts of the proposal were created by AI versus what pulled from a template
Mm-hmm.
versus what pulled from a data source, because it's
Mm-hmm.
a combination of those things that, going back to my previous answer, which is how does a human actually work, is how you get an output. And so we're deeply
Mm-hmm.
integrated into Copilot. We're integrated into Claude. We're integrated into essentially all of the solutions that are popular in the
Mm-hmm.
market. Because one of the key things that we can't do a year from now is that we don't know who's going to be in the lead. We don't know what underlying model they're going to use. And frankly, we don't care. Whatever the underlying model is that's pre-trained or is running on RAG, will connect to that model in order to deliver that output. We're hyper focused on making sure that when you create content, when you put in a prompt, you get the output that you're expecting to get
Mm-hmm.
in those cases,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
reduces the token burn we talked about. Like if you're creating a proposal, we're going to give you a good proposal. You're not going to have an end user essentially quit midstream or go through
Mm-hmm.
18 variations of it, all running up costs while still not getting the output that they want.
Right. In my, admittedly limited use of AI because I'm working in a very small company, I found consistency to be a big issue. So I can imagine that this orchestration layer that you put in place also helps to achieve not just accuracy in terms of the information that's being provided, but also consistency. I don't know, in terms of branding, layout, formatting, all that kind of stuff to make sure that you're producing a document that actually, can be used at the end of the day. Would that be right?
Exactly. You need consistency, right? I think that the key here and what organizations are looking for is something that gives a result that can be
Mm-hmm.
used. And I think
Yeah.
that's what
Yeah.
we're hyper focused on is iteration is good, but iteration costs money. So
Yeah.
unlike I'd say the internet, like, yeah, you could keep on searching, right? That doesn't change the bill. But when
Mm-hmm.
individual employees are searching, when individual employees are consuming tokens, if you're a CIO, at some point you got to scream uncle and say, okay, am I getting the value that I'm supposed to be getting from AI? When iteration probably consumes more tokens than actual output. And
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the
Mm-hmm.
key
Mm-hmm.
differentiators is we can kind of guarantee that you're going to get a usable output, especially if you start automating with Templafy.
Right. So in Templafy's experience, in your experience, when companies go down this, route of using AI in document workflows, maybe for the first time, at scale, what's the kind of a hidden constraint or risk that they often miss at the beginning and kind of takes them by surprise, if you like?
I think it's the belief that they're buying magic buttons. I think that's what takes. No, seriously, right? Like,
Right.
like
Right.
it's, hey, I'm going to buy this. I'm going to hand it over to 1,000 people, and they're going to be able to do everything that they want magically without necessarily putting in the upfront work. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the key things I've been reading about recently is how, especially small organizations, they are outsourcing the upfront work on how do you configure the solution so that way it gives you a great output, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when when you think about AI, like what it does extremely well is that, okay, if there's a bunch of source information within the organization, it allows, like we talked about with the printing press, every employee now has the ability to come up with a really good 80% answer. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you're following the 80-20 rule, it's that 20 that's really, really hard if you don't plan for it. And then what ends
Mm-hmm.
up happening is you get a bill, and as a CIO, and you're like, wait a second, is this productivity matching right? The amount that we're spending. And I hate to talk about costs, but it's going to come to a head in 2027 and 2028.
Mm-hmm.
We're like, okay, like what are we actually getting out of this right now? So I
Mm-hmm.
think the
Mm-hmm.
biggest surprise is that software still matters, right? If you look at, Anthropic's job posts, they're hiring a lot of software engineers, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
see that, right? You see companies needing folks that are able to build the piping around AI,
Mm-hmm.
right? You need to be able to deliver the right information at the right time to allow the model to work well and
Mm-hmm.
control. So I think that's the thing that people aren't they're not necessarily thinking about. It's like, what is my
Mm-hmm.
iteration cost? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how many searches need to happen for this very basic thing to
Mm-hmm.
happen? And people aren't thinking about that yet.
Mm-hmm.
And they will soon, because at some point, the CEO, the board, the business will be like, hey, look, we're spending $40 million or $30 million on AI consumption. And are we getting the productivity gains that we're supposed to get?
Mm-hmm. So I think you've really answered my question about what are the, some of the limitations that, teams have to acknowledge. And I think, it's not a magic button. I think it pretty much answers that question, unless you've got anything else to add. But I wonder, are there certain, I don't know, types of documents or types of document workflows that are not suited to this or require, a human in the loop?
I think that the way to think about it, it's a spectrum of content, right? So, and I like to call it if you think about it from a commercial perspective, usually the first thing that happens is there's a pitch, right? So there's a pitch,
Mm-hmm.
there's a back and forth, there's product description decks, there's contracting that happens all the way at the end, and everything in between. And the way to think about it from an AI content creation perspective is that when we talk about documents where I don't want to call it room for error, I want to call it room for variability,
Mm-hmm.
then those tend to be extremely suited for AI, right? So if we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
these pitch decks, if we're talking about the about us, if we're talking about our capabilities, you can get accurate information, but organizations, at least we've observed, they're willing to live with a little bit of variability up front in
Mm-hmm.
those core
Mm-hmm.
documents. Now,
Yep.
when we jump to contracting, the difference between a may and shall can make a monstrous difference in the outcome for an
Mm-hmm.
organization. And so in
Right.
those cases, how we deal with that is rules-based automation. We can use rules-based automation to assure that based on the user selection, like 100% of the time, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
language that was selected by legal and the commercial teams
Mm-hmm.
show up in the document that way. But at the
Right.
same time, leaving room for that universal content creation. And if we take
Mm-hmm.
it outside of the commercial sphere, you need to run into, let's say, a meeting in an hour, right? The example you had, and it's not a proposal. Let's say you've had 10 meetings. You need to summarize those meetings. You need to condense it. You need to have this conversation in 5 minutes. In
Mm-hmm.
those cases, AI is super fantastic, and it really reduces the amount of friction and time that it takes to do that. Even
Mm-hmm.
this morning, I had to deliver a slide. This needed to be out by 8 a.m. I was up at 5 a.m. And that was a perfect candidate for our
Mm-hmm.
universal document agent, which was like, look, man, like, here's all this content. Give me
Mm-hmm.
V1. I had 30 minutes before hopping on the train in order to quickly do it. And I was able to use our universal
Yep.
capability in order to create an output because I wasn't as concerned as with it being exacting. And so in the middle, there's that blend, right? There's some components. If you're talking about a proposal, for example, that's in the middle where, yes, the about us should be pretty standard. The product description should be pretty standard. Our pricing for the love of all things that are good, do not make that up on that bit. And then you
Mm-hmm.
have, okay, what was the differentiators? Great. You can allow for some variability.
Mm-hmm.
What was
Mm-hmm.
spoken about? What were the business needs? Like in those cases, you can allow AI to do what AI does, which is it does a fantastic job of taking a lot of information and summarizing it in a consumable way. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's the spectrum at the end of the day that really matters, and also giving organizations a choice to use our rules-based capabilities, but at the same time benefiting with AI where there is
Mm-hmm.
that ability to live with a bit of
Mm-hmm.
variability. And that's just the fact of working with AI today that there's variations. You can put in a prompt, I could put in a prompt, Susie could put up a prompt, and we're going to get to slightly varied outputs. And what we're doing is making sure that that control happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So somebody's watching this video today, if they've heard what you said, what's the best way to find out a little bit about how Templafy actually works in practice? Is it possible to get hands-on, or have you got some materials they can go and watch?
Absolutely. They can get hands-on today, right? We've launched Templafy Liberate, which is giving essentially anyone who would like to come on our site the ability to see the power of Templafy. And what they're going to find is that when you put in your prompt, when you request a presentation in those cases, you're going to see the amount of control that we can deliver, the fact that we can essentially meet a core template, that it's going to look good, and that you're going to get an output that should meet your specific need. Now, the next step of that is that we're going to start potentially allowing individuals to bring their own templates. For now, essentially it's static, but I think what we're proving to the world right now is that if you need prompt to presentation for professionals, and those are people that these presentations and this content is not simply a presentation, it's a representative of the quality of work that they can put out. And if it really matters to them, there's the ability to go on our site and leverage it. Now, if you want to do something complex, great. We have a site they can go on, request a demo, and we're happy to walk them through how to do this, especially if we're talking about proposal automation, audit reports, if we're talking about clinical trial documents, product descriptions. In those cases, it's best that they go on our site, take a demo with Templafy, so that they can see the power of prompt to presentation for professionals.
Okay, that sounds great. So Templafy.com or something else?
It's Templafy.com. That's
Templafy.com. Okay.
Easy to find from
there. All right. Well, that's a really interesting conversation. I wasn't really aware of Templafy before meeting you today and preparing for this podcast episode. So I'm quite interested to go and look in more detail and actually get a hands-on, if possible, to see what it can really do. It seems really fascinating. So I'd like to really thank you for your time today, Jean-Marc. What a great conversation.
Well, thank you for your time today. I appreciate it. And, fantastic convo.
Yep. And if you're watching, do go out and check out templafy.com. But that's it for today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.